I never imagined that loneliness could be so intense and overwhelming, surrounded by luxury and comfort. My name is Claire, and for years I believed I had a perfect life. My husband Adrian is an accomplished businessman, dedicated and passionate about his work. However, it was this same passion that fueled him professionally that gradually began to erode our relationship. His days started early, long before the sun rose. He would quietly get up, make his coffee, and leave the house without even waking the children. By the time I got up, the house was already steeped in a deathly silence, interrupted only by the occasional murmur of the morning news on TV. My days consisted of a meticulous routine. After dropping the children off at school, I devoted myself to my own projects and hobbies, but there was always a shadow of emptiness at the back of my mind. Dinners at our large table were always for one. Adrian was rarely home for dinner, and when he was, his mind was always at the office, checking emails on his laptop or taking urgent calls. The nights were the worst. I would lie awake in bed, staring at the ceiling, waiting for the sound of the front door opening, a sign that he had finally arrived. Sometimes the wait extended into the early hours of the morning. When he finally lay down next to me, I was so exhausted that I had a hard time keeping my eyes open. We had become strangers sharing a bed but not a life. I tried to talk to him about it several times. I expressed my need to spend more time together, to feel valued and loved. Each time, Adrian looked at me with tired eyes and said he understood, that he would try to make changes. But those changes never happened. I felt like a shadow in his life, present but invisible. My friends told me I should be grateful. You have everything you could want, they said. A beautiful house, wonderful children, a husband who provides for you. But those words didn't fill the void I felt. I needed something more, something that money and luxury couldn't buy. It was on one of those lonely mornings during my routine walk around the neighborhood that I saw him for the first time. He was sitting on the corner of the street, his clothes worn, his gaze lost in the horizon. He didn't seem to be begging or bothering anyone. He was just there, an invisible figure to the other passers-by. I don't know why, but something about his presence intrigued me. There was a calmness in his eyes, a kind of peaceful resignation that contrasted with my own inner turmoil. I walked past him the first time, but I couldn't get him out of my mind. In the days that followed, I changed my walking route to pass by that same corner of the street. Each time I saw him, I felt a sort of inexplicable connection. It was as if somehow, he could see through my facade of a happy, affluent woman and sense the true loneliness I carried within me. Finally, one day, I decided to do something. I took an extra sandwich from the kitchen and headed towards him. As I approached, he looked up and smiled at me. It was a warm and genuine smile, something I hadn't seen in a long time. I offered him the sandwich, and as he took it, our hands briefly touched. That small contact was like a spark of electricity, igniting something in me. We didn't exchange many words that day, but his smile and thanks stayed with me. On my way home, I felt strange, invigorated, as if I had taken the first step towards something new, something that would fill the void in my heart. After that first gesture, I couldn't help but return every morning. Leaving the house to go for a walk, I made sure to bring something for him, a coffee, a sandwich, a bottle of water. We began to talk little by little. His name was Julien, and he had a soft, almost hypnotic voice. At first, our conversations were superficial, limited to a simple thank you and how are you? But over time, we began to talk about more personal things. Julien told me how he ended up on the street, a victim of a series of bad decisions and a cruel economy. He was a man with a promising future, but everything quickly fell apart. What surprised me most was his attitude. There was no bitterness in him, just a calm acceptance of his situation. This fascinated me and made me want to know more. I began to open up in turn. I told him about my marriage, about Adrian, and how his work had driven us apart. At first, I didn't give him too many details, but Julien seemed to understand me without needing long explanations. There was something in his eyes, in his way of listening, that made me feel understood. One morning, after dropping the children off at school, I found myself walking faster than usual, eager to see Julien. When I reached his corner, I found him sitting on the ground, his back against the wall, his eyes closed, enjoying the morning sun. I approached and sat next to him, offering the coffee I had brought. "Good morning, Julien," I said, trying to sound casual even though my heart was racing. "Good morning, Claire," he replied, opening his eyes and smiling at me. "Thanks for the coffee." We sat in silence for a while, enjoying each other's company. Then he began to talk about his past, his broken dreams, and the hopes he still held on to. I found myself telling him things I had never shared with anyone, not even with Adrian. I talked to him about my own aspirations, the dreams I had given up for my family, and how I felt trapped in a life that wasn't really mine. Julien listened to me with an attention that I found intoxicating. He didn't interrupt me, he didn't give unsolicited advice, he simply let me talk, absorbing every word. He made me feel seen, important, something I hadn't felt in a long time. We started seeing each other almost every day. My morning walks became our little bubble of intimacy. We laughed together, shared stories, and somehow built a bond that seemed unbreakable. Our relationship was marked by an honesty that I didn't have in my marriage. With Julien, I could be myself without fear of being judged or ignored. One morning, after a particularly deep conversation, I dared to ask him something that had been on my mind for some time. "Julien, have you ever thought about leaving here, trying to start over?" He looked at me with his deep, serene eyes, then lowered them. "Sometimes, Claire, but it's difficult. I don't have the resources or opportunities, and to be honest, I've already lost hope that things will change." His answer hurt me more than I expected. I wanted to help him, to do something to change his life, but I also knew my resources were limited. Still, I refused to accept that he was doomed to this life forever. Never lose hope, Julien. Sometimes things can change when you least expect it. He smiled at me, but his eyes reflected a sadness he couldn't hide. We stayed like that for a moment, then he changed the subject, talking about something mundane like the weather. But inside me, the idea of helping him out of this situation had firmly taken root. That night, lying next to Adrian, who as usual was absorbed in his phone, I thought about Julien and how my life had changed in such a short time. I realized I couldn't ignore what I felt anymore. I had to do something, not only for him but also for me. The days following our conversation about hope were marked by a mix of emotions. I felt an increasing need to be close to Julien, to help him, but also a growing guilt about what this might mean for my marriage. Yet I couldn't ignore the spark of life he had ignited in me. One morning, as I was preparing breakfast for the children, I decided to take things further. I prepared an extra sandwich, carefully placed it in a paper bag. When I arrived at the corner where Julien usually stood, I found him in his usual posture, staring into the distance with a vacant look. I approached him and, without saying a word, offered him the bag. His eyes lit up at the sight of it. "Thank you, Claire," he said, accepting it with a warm smile. I sat next to him, and for a moment, we just watched people coming and going. Finally, I broke the silence. "Julien, I've been thinking about what you said the other day about having no hope." He sighed and nodded but said nothing. I continued, "I want to help you somehow. I don't know exactly how, but I can't just stand by and do nothing." Julien looked at me with a mix of surprise and gratitude. "You are very kind, Claire, but as I told you, it's complicated." "I know it's complicated," I replied, "but that doesn't mean it's impossible. Let me at least try." We spent the rest of the morning discussing possible solutions. I suggested a few ideas, like looking for a job, finding temporary housing, or even contacting aid organizations. Julien seemed hesitant, but little by little, he opened up to the possibility. That day, when I returned home, I felt more determined than ever. I wanted to make a difference in Julien's life, and I also wanted to rediscover some of the passion and enthusiasm I had lost in my own marriage. Adrian, as usual, was engrossed in his work, but I didn't care. I had a mission, and that gave me strength. In the weeks that followed, our morning meetings became even more important to me. They were not only a moment of escape from my daily routine but also an opportunity to plan and dream of a better future, both for Julien and for me. We grew closer, and I started feeling something I hadn't felt in a long time, a genuine and deep connection. One morning, as I was bringing him his usual coffee, our hands accidentally brushed. It was a brief, almost insignificant contact, but the warmth of his skin against mine sent a spark through my body. Our eyes met, and for a moment, the world stopped. "Sorry," I murmured, feeling my cheeks flush. "You don't have to apologize," he replied with a smile, holding his hand on mine a few seconds longer than necessary. This small gesture was the catalyst for something bigger. From that moment on, our encounters became charged with a subtle but palpable tension. There was something in the air, something we both felt but didn't dare to name. Our conversations became more intimate, as did our physical contact, a touch here, an accidental caress there. Each contact made me feel alive, reminded me what it was like to be desired, to be seen. Finally, one day, I decided to invite him to a nearby park. It was a quiet place, away from the prying eyes of the neighbors. Julien accepted without hesitation, and that afternoon was magical. We walked, laughed, and talked about everything and nothing. I felt like a teenager discovering love for the first time. As evening approached, we sat on a bench, and without a word, Julien took my hand. His touch was gentle, almost reverent, and it made me feel a mix of exhilaration and fear. I knew I was crossing a line, but I couldn't help it. The bond one felt with him was too strong, too real. That night, lying next to Adrian, I felt a sense of guilt but also an inexplicable joy. I knew my life was changing, that I was entering something new and unknown, and for the first time in a long time, I was excited about what the future might bring. Afternoons in the park became a routine. Whenever I had a free moment, I would go to that special place with Julien. There was something in the tranquility of those meetings that made me feel alive, that filled the void Adrian had left in my heart. With each conversation, I felt like I knew Julien more deeply, and he, in return, seemed to understand me in a way no one else did. One particularly hot afternoon, we found ourselves on our usual bench. Julien seemed thoughtful, and I felt an increasing need to know more about him, about what had led him to his current situation. "Julien," I said, breaking the silence, "have you ever dreamed of something else, of another life?" He looked at me, his eyes reflecting a mix of surprise and sadness. "Claire, we all have dreams, but sometimes life has other plans. Tell me," I insisted gently, "I want to know more about you." Julien sighed and began to speak. He told me about his childhood in a small town, his parents, and how he always wanted to make them proud. He spoke about his studies, his ambition to become an engineer, and how everything fell apart when the company he worked for closed its doors overnight. With each word, I could feel the pain and disappointment he had experienced. "I lost my job, my home, and eventually my family," he said, his voice laden with emotion. "I ended up on the street, not knowing what to do, with nowhere to go. I'm so sorry, Julien," I whispered, feeling a lump in my throat. "I can't imagine how hard it must have been." "It was hard," he admitted, "but it also taught me a lot about life, about what really matters." We remained silent for a while, each lost in our thoughts. Then Julien broke the silence with a question that took me by surprise. "And you, Claire, what do you dream about?" This question left me speechless. It had been so long since I had thought about my own dreams that I had almost forgotten what they were. But looking at Julien, I felt the need to be honest. "I dream of being happy," I finally replied. "I dream of feeling alive, loved, appreciated. But I also dream of helping others, of making a difference in someone's life." Julien nodded, his eyes shining with understanding. "Those are beautiful dreams, Claire, and you deserve to achieve them." We stayed in the park until the sun began to set, enjoying each other's company without needing words. I felt more connected to Julien than ever, and I knew these feelings were dangerous but also irresistible. In the following weeks, our conversations deepened. We talked about everything, our fears and regrets, our hopes and aspirations. With each encounter, I felt like I knew Julien on a more intimate level, and he knew me in the same way. One day, as we were walking in the park, Julien surprised me by asking a question that stopped me in my tracks. "Claire, have you ever thought about leaving all this behind, starting over?" I looked at him, my heart racing. "What do you mean?" "I mean," he continued, "have you ever thought about leaving Adrian and pursuing your own happiness?" This question took my breath away. Of course, I had thought about it in moments of loneliness and despair, but I had never seriously considered it. The idea of leaving my well-ordered life, my children, everything I knew, terrified me. But at the same time, the prospect of a new life where I could be truly happy attracted me in a way I couldn't deny. I don't know if I could do it, I finally admitted, but the idea isn't completely far-fetched. Julien nodded, and I understood that even though he didn't say it out loud, he too longed for a change, a chance to start over. That night, lying next to Adrien, I couldn't stop thinking about the conversation with Julien. I knew I was playing with fire, that my feelings for him were dangerous, but I couldn't help it. The connection I had with Julien was real, and it made me question everything I took for granted. The meetings in the park continued, becoming more and more intimate and charged with a palpable tension. We knew we were crossing lines, but neither of us seemed willing to stop. There was something in the connection, a mutual understanding without words, that made everything else irrelevant. One afternoon, as we sat on our usual bench, I noticed Julien was particularly pensive. I asked him what was wrong, and after a moment, he spoke with an intensity that took my breath away. "Claire," he said softly, "there's something I want to tell you." My heart started to beat faster, anticipating what was coming. "Tell me, Julien." He took a deep breath, slowly reached out his hand to mine. The touch of his skin against mine was like an electric shock, a spark that ignited something deep within me. "I can't deny it anymore," he continued. "I care about you more than I should. I feel something for you, something I can't ignore." These words resonated in my mind, and I felt a mix of exhilaration and fear. I knew I had to be honest with him and with myself. "I feel the same way, Julien," I murmured, squeezing his hand. "I feel the same way." We remained in silence, our hands intertwined, letting the unspoken words fill the space between us. The physical contact, though simple, was profoundly intimate and made me feel closer to him than I had ever felt to Adrien. From that moment on, our relationship took a new direction. The touches became more frequent, more deliberate, a caress on the arm, a brush on the cheek. Each touch sent waves of emotion through my body. I felt like I was living a new life, a life I had been waiting for a long time. One day, after a long walk, we stopped in a clearing in the park, away from prying eyes. Julien turned to me, and without a word, he took me in his arms. The embrace was warm, comforting, and I felt all the pieces of my life finally falling into place. "Claire," he whispered against my hair, "I don't want this to end." "Neither do I," I replied, holding on to him as if my life depended on it. We stayed like that, holding each other, for what felt like an eternity. At that moment, I knew I couldn't ignore my feelings anymore. Julien had awakened something in me, something I couldn't extinguish. That night, lying next to Adrien, I felt a sense of guilt. I knew what I was doing was wrong, but I couldn't help it. The connection I felt with Julien was real, and it made me question everything I took for granted in my life. With each encounter, the attraction between us grew stronger. One day, as we were saying goodbye in the park, Julien took my hand and looked me in the eyes. "Claire, can I kiss you?" The question surprised me, but my answer was immediate. "Yes." Julien leaned in, and slowly, his lips met mine. The kiss was initially gentle but quickly became more passionate. I felt a wave of emotion, from relief to exhilaration, as our lips moved in unison. When we finally parted, we were both breathing heavily. "That was incredible," I murmured, still feeling the warmth of his lips on mine. "It was," Julien added, smiling. "I want more, Claire. I want everything with you." These words sent a shiver through me. I knew we were crossing a dangerous line, but I also knew I couldn't help it. The connection I had with Julien was too strong, too real to be ignored. That night, lying next to Adrien, I felt a mix of guilt and excitement. I knew I was playing with fire, but it was stronger than me. Julien had shown me what it meant to feel alive, and I couldn't ignore it. The weeks following my first kiss with Julien were a mix of euphoria and inner torment. Each encounter with him felt like an escape to a world where anything was possible, where my desires and needs were heard and appreciated. Yet, each return home reminded me of the life I was leaving behind, a life that, although unsatisfactory, was the one I knew. My thoughts were in constant conflict. I loved my children and felt obligated to Adrien, but at the same time, I couldn't ignore the feelings Julien had awakened in me. Each time we met, the attraction and connection grew stronger, and I felt I was approaching a point of no return. One afternoon, as we were sitting in the park, Julien took my hand and looked at me seriously. "Claire, we need to talk." His tone worried me, and I felt a knot form in my stomach. "What's wrong, Julien?" He took a deep breath before continuing. "I can't keep seeing you only during these brief moments and losing you again. I need to know if there's a real possibility for us to be together." His statement took my breath away. I knew he was right. We couldn't continue this clandestine relationship indefinitely. It was unfair to both of us and was starting to affect my daily life. "I know," I replied calmly, "but it's complicated. It's not just about Adrien, there are the children, my life here." Julien squeezed my hand tighter. "I understand, Claire, but we can't live in this bubble forever. We need to make a decision." That night, lying next to Adrien, these words echoed in my mind. I realized I could no longer avoid reality. I had to make a decision, as painful as it might be. I spent the following days in a constant state of anxiety, trying to imagine all the possible consequences of my choice. I knew that the decision I would make, whatever it was, would change my life forever. Finally, one evening after putting the children to bed, I sat with Adrien in the living room. "Adrien, we need to talk." He looked up from his laptop, surprised by the tone of my voice. "What's wrong, Claire?" I took a deep breath, trying to find the right words. "I haven't been happy, Adrien. I've felt lonely, ignored, and in the midst of this loneliness, I met someone." His eyes widened, and his expression shifted from surprise to incredulity. "What are you saying, Claire?" "I'm saying I found someone who makes me feel alive, someone who listens to me and understands me, and I'm considering leaving all this to be with him." A tense silence settled in the room. Adrien looked at me intently, understanding what I had just said. His voice was barely a whisper, full of pain and surprise. "I can't believe you're doing this, Claire. What about the children? What about our life together?" "I know it's complicated," I replied, trying to stay calm, "but I can't continue living a lie. We both deserve to be happy." The conversation continued for hours, filled with tears, reproaches, and finally, painful understanding. Adrien was devastated, but he also acknowledged that our relationship had been struggling for a long time. In the end, we agreed that it would be best to take some time apart to reflect on what we truly wanted. That night, I fell asleep in the guest room with a mix of relief and sadness. I knew I had made an important decision that would change my life forever, but I also felt the weight of the consequences. The following days were difficult. Adrien and I talked to the children, explaining as best we could that we needed time to sort out our differences. It was a painful but necessary conversation. Finally, one morning after dropping the children off at school, I found myself walking toward the park with renewed determination. I knew I needed to talk to Julien, to be honest with him about what I had decided. When I arrived at our usual bench, he was already there, waiting for me. When he saw me, he stood up and smiled, but I could also see the worry in his eyes. "Claire, are you okay?" I nodded, tears threatening to spill. "I've made a decision, Julien." I talked to Adrien. "We're going to take some time apart." He looked at me with a mix of relief and worry. "And what does that mean for us?" I took his hands and squeezed them tightly. "It means I want to try with you, Julien. I want to see if we can truly be happy together." His smile widened, and without a word, he pulled me into his arms, holding me tightly. At that moment, I felt a surge of hope and determination. I knew the road would be difficult, but I also knew that, for the first time in a long time, I was following my heart. After deciding to separate from Adrien and commit to a new life with Julien, everything seemed different. There was a palpable excitement in the air, an anticipation that made me feel alive in a way I hadn't in years. Each meeting with Julien was a mix of excitement and discovery, and we grew closer every day. One afternoon, as we were walking in the park, Julien turned to me with a serious expression. "Claire, I need to tell you something." His tone worried me but also piqued my curiosity. "Tell me, Julien." He took my hands and looked me in the eyes. "I love you, Claire. I can't hide it anymore." I'm in love with you. These words resonated in my heart, filling it with a warmth I had never felt before. I knew I loved him too, even if I hadn't allowed myself to fully admit it until that moment. I love you too, Julien, I murmured, tears filling my eyes. I love you more than I can express. We held each other, letting the moment wash over us. I felt like I was in the right place, with the right person. After a few moments, Julien pulled away slightly and looked at me with an intensity that made me shiver. Come with me, Claire. I want to show you something. I nodded without asking questions. Together, we walked to a small hotel a few blocks from the park. Julien had reserved a room, a place where we could be alone and away from prying eyes. We entered the room, and as the door closed, the tension between us became almost palpable. Julien approached me slowly, his eyes never leaving mine. My heart raced as he raised a hand to caress my cheek. You are so beautiful, Claire, he murmured, his voice full of admiration. I felt a warmth spread through my body as he leaned in and kissed me gently. The kiss quickly became more passionate, and we lost ourselves in the moment. His hands roamed my body with a tenderness and urgency that made me feel desired and loved like never before. We moved together to the bed, and in that private space, we gave ourselves completely to each other. It was an intense experience, full of love and passion. Every touch, every kiss seemed to ignite a spark in me, and I felt all the barriers I had built around myself crumble. When we finally parted, we were both out of breath, our skin glistening with a fine layer of sweat. We held each other, letting the calm after the passion wash over us. That was incredible, I murmured, running my fingers through his hair. It was, Julien replied, kissing my forehead. I don't want it to ever end. We stayed in bed, cuddling, talking softly about our dreams and hopes for the future. I felt closer to Julien than ever, and I knew I had made the right decision in following my heart. The following days were a mix of happiness and adjustment. Julien and I spent every free moment together, exploring our new relationship and building a life together. But at the same time, I knew I had to face the reality of my situation with Adrian and the children. One afternoon, as I was at home, I received a message from Adrian. My heart raced when I saw his name on the screen, and with trembling hands, I opened the message. What I saw shocked me. It was a video, clearly filmed from a nearby window, showing Julien and me in the park, embracing and kissing. The attached message was short and direct: "Get out of our house and don't come back." I felt the ground slip away from under my feet. The reality of my actions and their consequences became painfully clear. I knew I had to act quickly. I packed a few essential items and left the house without looking back. I headed to the hotel where Julien and I had spent so much time together, knowing it was the only place I could find comfort. That night, as I sat alone in the hotel room, I felt a mix of regret and determination. I had made a decision that had changed my life forever, and now I had to face the consequences. I knew it wouldn't be easy, but I also knew I had found something true and precious with Julien, and for that reason, I was willing to fight for my new life, no matter what the future held. Returning home after that passionate evening with Julien was like waking up from a dream. I felt a mix of emotions, the exhilaration of what we had shared and a growing sense of guilt. As I drove, my thoughts were divided between the joy of having found someone who made me feel alive and the weight of the consequences of my actions. Arriving home, everything seemed the same, but I knew nothing would ever be the same. Adrian was in his office as usual, absorbed in his work. I greeted the children, making sure they were okay, then headed to the kitchen to prepare dinner. Every movement felt mechanical, as if I was watching my own life from the outside. That night, as we ate dinner in silence, I couldn't help but look at him, my husband. I wondered how many times I had wished he would look at me the way Julien did, with that mix of love and admiration. But Adrian was focused on his meal, unaware of the emotional storm raging inside me. After putting the children to bed, I found myself alone in our bedroom, my mind full of thoughts and my heart heavy. Adrian was still in his office, probably finishing a report or responding to emails. I lay down on the bed, but sleep wouldn't come. My mind kept replaying the moments with Julien, the passion, the connection, the freedom I felt when I was with him. Finally, Adrian entered the bedroom. Without a word, He slipped into bed next to me and turned off the light. I felt his presence as a constant reminder of the life I was leaving behind. I knew I had to talk to him, but the words stayed stuck in my throat. It took several days before I found the courage to face the situation. I knew I couldn't continue living this double life, and sooner or later, Adrian would find out. One evening, after putting the children to bed, I sat in the living room, waiting for him to finish his work. When he finally joined me, I could see the exhaustion in his eyes. I took a deep breath, trying to find the right words. "Adrian, we need to talk," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. He looked up, surprised by the seriousness in my voice. "What's wrong, Claire?" I took another deep breath, feeling the weight of the words I was about to say almost unbearable. "I've met someone," I began, feeling the lump in my throat tighten, "someone who made me feel things I haven't felt in a long time." His face shifted from surprise to incredulity, then to pain. "What are you saying, Claire? Are you telling me that?" I nodded, feeling the tears fill my eyes. "Yes, Adrian. I've seen him, and I've fallen in love with him." A tense silence settled in the room. Adrian looked at me, analyzing my words. Finally, he stood up, his face marked by pain and betrayal. "How could you do this to me?" His voice was barely a whisper, filled with incredulity. "How could you do this to us, to our family?" Tears streamed down my cheeks as I tried to find an answer. "I'm sorry, Adrian. I didn't want this to happen, but I can't ignore what I feel." He remained silent for a moment, then took a deep breath. "I want you to leave," he finally said. "I want you to leave and not come back." I felt the ground open up beneath my feet. I knew this was a possibility, but hearing the words out loud was devastating. I nodded, knowing I had no choice. "Okay," I murmured, "I'm leaving." I packed a few essential items and headed to the hotel where Julien and I had spent so much time together. I knew it was the only place where I could find comfort at that moment. Upon arriving, I was overwhelmed by conflicting emotions, the pain of losing my family and the hope of a new beginning with Julien. That night, sitting alone in the hotel room, I reflected on what I had done. I knew I had made a decision that would change my life forever, but I also knew I had found something true and precious with Julien. I was ready to face the consequences of my actions, knowing that I was following my heart and pursuing the happiness I had long yearned for. The first night at the hotel was one of the hardest of my life. I was alone, surrounded by strange walls, feeling the weight of my decisions and the consequences they had brought. I sat on the bed, staring at the phone, knowing that at some point, I would have to call Julien and explain what had happened. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I dialed his number. The sound of his voice when he answered brought a mix of comfort and pain. "Claire, where are you?" I was worried. I took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. "I'm at the hotel, Julien. Adrian found out everything. He asked me to leave." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. I could feel the tension and worry in his voice when he finally spoke. "I'm on my way. Give me the address." I gave him the address of the hotel and hung up, feeling a bit calmer knowing he was coming. As I waited, my thoughts swirled in my mind. I wondered how I had gotten to this point, how I had let my life fall apart like this. When Julien arrived, his presence was a balm for my soul. He held me tightly in his arms, and at that moment, all the emotions I had been holding back surfaced. I cried in his arms, letting out the pain, guilt, and fear. "I'm here, Claire," he whispered gently, "everything will be okay." We sat on the bed, and I told him everything that had happened. His eyes reflected a mix of sadness and determination. "Claire, I don't want you to feel guilty. I know this is difficult, but you made a courageous decision. We're in this together." His words gave me strength, and for the first time in days, I felt a spark of hope. I knew the road ahead would be hard, but I also knew that Julien was by my side. The following days were a whirlwind of emotions and decisions. I spoke to the children on the phone, reassuring them that I loved them and that we would always stay in touch. Adrian and I discussed the details of our separation, trying to make the process as painless as possible for the children. One evening, as I was in my hotel room, I received an unexpected message. It was from a neighbor I had known for years but had never had a close relationship with. The message was short and to the point: "We need to talk. It's important." Intrigued and a bit worried, I responded, and we agreed to meet at a nearby cafe. When I arrived, she was already there, waiting for me with a serious expression on her face. "Claire, thank you for coming," she said, gesturing to the chair in front of her. "I think there's something you need to know." I sat down, feeling a growing unease. "What is it?" She took a deep breath and began to speak. "A while ago, I noticed something strange about Adrian. I thought it was my duty to tell you, but I didn't know how. Now, after everything that's happened, I think it's important you know the truth." I looked at her, confused and anxious. "What are you talking about?" She pulled out her phone and showed me a video. At first, I didn't understand what I was seeing. Then I recognized a neighbor's house and felt sick watching the footage. It was a video of Julien and me in the park, clearly filmed from a nearby window. The angle and quality were too good to be a coincidence. "Where did you get this?" I asked, a mix of anger and despair. "I found it on my husband's computer. It seems Adrian asked him to spy on you. I think he hired a private detective." These words were like a bomb. I felt the world collapsing around me. Adrian had known from the beginning. He had been watching me, waiting for the moment to confront me. The betrayal and manipulation made me nauseous. "Why are you telling me this now?" I asked, trying to stay calm. "Because I think you deserve to know the truth. Adrian isn't who you think he is. He's been controlling and manipulating the situation from the start." These words echoed in my mind as I left the cafe. I felt a mix of anger, betrayal, and despair. I knew I needed to talk to Julien, to tell him everything I had discovered. We needed to face this together. That night, I told Julien what I had learned. His face hardened, a mix of anger and worry. "I can't believe Adrian did this," he said, his voice trembling with emotion. "But we can't let him destroy us. We're in this together, Claire." Those words gave me strength, and we started planning our next steps together. We knew the road ahead would be hard, but we also knew that, with love and mutual support, we could overcome any obstacles. The days spent at the hotel became a strange and lonely routine. I felt stuck in limbo, between the past I had left behind and the uncertain future that awaited me. Each day was a mix of hope and despair, of regret and determination. Julien was my rock during this time. His unwavering love and support helped me stay strong, reminding me that I had made the right decision in following my heart. We spent hours talking about our future, planning how we would rebuild our life together. One evening, as we sat on the hotel bed, Julien took my hand and looked at me with an intensity that made me shiver. "Claire, I know this is hard, but I want you to know that I'm here for you. We're going to get through this together." I nodded, feeling the tears fill my eyes. "Thank you, Julien. I don't know what I would do without you." "You don't have to do it alone," he replied, caressing my cheek. "We're in this together." The following days were a whirlwind of activity. I talked to a lawyer about the details of the separation and started looking for a new place to live. I knew I couldn't stay at the hotel forever. I needed a place where I could start over, a home for me and the children. Finally, I found a small apartment in the city center. It was neither luxurious nor large, but it was mine. It was a place where I could begin to rebuild my life. With Julien's help, I moved in and started decorating the space to make it a real home. The children were the hardest part. Talking to them, explaining why Mommy and Daddy were no longer living together, was heartbreaking. But over time, they began to adapt to the new situation. Adrian and I worked together to make sure they felt loved and supported despite everything that had happened. One day, as I was unpacking a box of books in the new apartment, I found an old diary. It dated back to my university days and was filled with dreams and aspirations I had left behind. As I read the yellowed pages, I realized how much I had changed, how much I had lost sight of my aspirations. Sitting on the floor of my new home, I allowed myself to cry for everything I had left behind. I cried for the marriage I had failed, for the dreams I had abandoned, for the pain I had caused and endured. But I also cried with relief, knowing that I had found the courage to follow my heart, to pursue the happiness I had long yearned for. Julien arrived later that night, bringing takeout and a bottle of wine. We sat on the floor, surrounded by boxes and memories, and toasted to the future. To new beginnings, Julien said, raising his glass. To new beginnings, I repeated, feeling a spark of hope in my heart. As we ate and talked, I realized that despite the pain and uncertainty, I had found something true and precious with Julien. Our love was a source of strength and hope, something that gave me the courage to keep going. The months that followed were a mix of highs and lows. There were moments of doubt and fear, but also moments of joy and love. Little by little, I began to feel more secure in my new life, more firm in my decision to follow my heart. One day, as we were walking in the park where it all began, Julien stopped and looked at me with a smile. "Claire, there's something I want to ask you." My heart raced when I saw the seriousness in his eyes. "What is it, Julien?" He took my hands and knelt down, pulling a small ring from his pocket. "Claire, I know the journey has been difficult, but I can't imagine my life without you. Will you marry me?" Tears filled my eyes, and I nodded, unable to speak. "Yes, Julien, yes, I will marry you." We kissed, feeling the weight of all our struggles and triumphs. At that moment, I knew I had found my true home, not in a place, but in the person beside me. The years that followed were a journey of love and discovery. Together, Julien and I built a life full of laughter, love, and adventures. There were challenges and difficulties, but we always knew we could count on each other. Looking back, I realized how much I had learned and grown. I had found the courage to follow my heart, to face the consequences of my actions, and to seek the happiness I deserved. And in doing so, I had found a true and lasting love. Betrayal and infidelity had changed my life in ways I could never have imagined, but they had also led me on a path of self-discovery and fulfillment. I had lost one life, but I had gained another, more authentic and fulfilling. So, as I walked hand in hand with Julien, I knew that despite all the challenges and difficulties, I had found my happy ending.